Her husband gave her to a mountain man as the punishment for not bearing sons. That's what folks whispered as the snow fell on the main street. She stood in the cold, her hands empty, her dignity stripped in front of a crowd that wouldn't meet her eyes. The giant in the wolf fur coat said nothing, just took her reins and led her away into the high country. But what waited in that lonely cabin wasn't chains. It was a secret. A boy hidden from the law. A paper worth more than gold to the right men and deadly to the wrong. The wind in the pines carried the sound of trouble, riders from the railroad, and one man who'd sworn she'd never see freedom again. In a land where a promise could be broken with a match, and winter could bury the truth before spring? What will she do when keeping that secret means saving the boy and the man who was never meant to be her husband? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The bitter January wind howled down the muddy main street of Silver Creek, Colorado, cutting through coats and scarves like a knife. Townsfolk huddled together in clusters, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. At the center of their attention stood Lila Mae Carter, her spine straight as a pine tree despite the cold that made her bones ache. Calvin Carter's voice rang out harsh and loud, meant to carry to every ear in the gathering crowd. "Ain't no use keeping a wife who can't give me sons!" His face was twisted with meanness, spittle flying from his mouth as he gestured at Lila Mae. 5 years I've fed and housed her, and what do I get? Nothing but an empty cradle and another mouth to feed. Lila Mae kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to let her tears fall. The whispers and stares of the townspeople pressed against her like physical weight, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her worn dress, trembled slightly. Calvin paced in front of her, his boots leaving dark prints in the new-fallen snow. "Well, I'm done with her. Done throwing good money after bad." He spun to face the crowd, his voice taking on the sing-song tone he used when trading for supplies. "Any man here want to take her off my hands? She can cook decent enough, knows her letters too." The silence that followed was broken only by the winter wind whistling between the buildings. Some of the women in the crowd looked away, unable to meet Lila Mae's steady gaze. Others whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes gleaming with the excitement of scandal. From the edge of the crowd came a movement. The townspeople parted like water around a stone as Elijah Boone stepped forward. The mountain man stood head and shoulders above most men, his massive frame wrapped in layers of fur and leather. Snow dusted his broad shoulders and the brim of his worn hat. Calvin's expression shifted from cruel satisfaction to uncertainty as he looked up at Boone. The trapper's reputation was well known in Silver Creek, a former cavalry scout who'd turned his back on the army for reasons no one quite knew. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he spoke little. "I'll take her," Boone said, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. The words fell into the hushed street like stones into still water. Calvin recovered quickly, a calculating look crossing his face. "Well now, Boone, didn't expect you'd be in the market for a wife." A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. "Didn't say nothing about a wife," Boone replied evenly. "Said I'd take her off your hands." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch that clinked with coins. Lila Mae's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her face carefully neutral. Trading her like a piece of property. It wasn't legal, wasn't right, but the law didn't always reach into these remote mountain towns, and what law there was rarely concerned itself with the rights of women who looked like her. Calvin snatched the pouch and counted the coins quickly. His eyebrows rose slightly at the amount. "She's yours then," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Hope you get more use out of her than I did." Without a word, Boone shrugged off his heavy buffalo hide coat and stepped toward Lila Mae. His movements were slow and deliberate, like someone approaching a spooked horse. With surprising gentleness, He draped the coat around her shoulders. The warmth of it, still carrying his body heat, made her realize how badly she'd been shaking. The crowd watched in tense silence as Boone led her to where his sled waited at the edge of town. 2 large mules stood in the traces, their breath steaming in the cold air. Small brass bells hung from their harnesses, tinkling softly as they shifted their weight. Boone helped her onto the sled without touching her more than necessary, then arranged thick fur robes around her legs. The buffalo coat engulfed her, smelling of wood smoke and pine. He took his place beside her, gathered the reins, and clicked softly to the mules. The sled pulled away from Silver Creek, the runners creaking against the snow. Louisa May didn't look back at the town or the man who had been her husband. She kept her eyes forward, watching as snowflakes began to fall more heavily, slowly erasing their tracks behind them. The sound of the mule bells grew fainter and fainter to the watching townspeople as the sled disappeared into the snow-blurred hills. The wind caught the last clear notes and scattered them across the white landscape, leaving only silence and the falling snow. Louisa May sat perfectly still, her mind whirling like the snowflakes around them. She didn't know what fate awaited her at the end of this journey, but she sent up a silent prayer of thanks for escape from Calvin's cruelty, even as uncertainty about her future made her stomach clench. The buffalo coat was warm, warmer than anything she'd worn in years, and that small kindness from this strange, silent man was enough to keep hope alive in her heart, at least for now. The mules plowed steadily through the deep snow, their breath coming in white puffs as they pulled the sled higher into the hills. The runners creaked against the frozen crust, and the brass bells kept steady time with each careful step. Snow had drifted knee-deep in places, making the going slow and treacherous. Louisa May huddled deeper into the buffalo coat, grateful for its warmth. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the white landscape, but provided little heat. Beside her, Elijah Boone sat straight and still, his eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead. He spoke only when necessary, his voice rough and low. "Mind them branches," he warned as they passed under snow-laden pine boughs. A moment later, "Hold tight here," as the sled tilted on a steep section. With nothing else to do, Louisa May studied her strange companion. His scarred hands held the reins with careful strength, each movement precise and measured. Dark lines etched his weathered face, speaking of years spent in sun and wind. A ragged scar ran from his left ear down into his collar, long healed but still visible. Everything about him suggested a man who chose his actions with deliberate care. But his intentions remained a mystery. He hadn't looked at her with the hunger she'd feared, nor treated her like property despite the morning's transaction. Still, experience had taught her that men's kindness often came with hidden costs. As the sun dipped toward the mountain peaks, Boone guided the mules off the trail toward a half-frozen creek. The water still moved beneath a skin of ice, its quiet gurgle the only sound besides the mules' breathing and the crunch of snow beneath the runners. "We'll camp here," he said, bringing the sled to a stop in a small clearing. "Creek water's good, and these pines'll break the wind." He climbed down and helped her from the sled with the same careful distance he'd shown in town. "First thing's to get shelter up before dark," he explained. "I'll show you how. Might need to know someday." Louisa May followed him to a stand of young pine trees. Boone demonstrated how to cut and stack the boughs, layering them against the wind. His breathing grew labored with the work, and a deep cough shook his frame more than once. Still, his hands never faltered as he taught her the proper way to weave the branches together. "Like this?" she asked, copying his technique. He nodded. "Good. You learn quick." They worked in companionable silence until they had a sturdy windbreak. Boone then showed her how to set up a canvas lean-to, angled to reflect the heat of the fire he built. The flames caught quickly in the dry pine needles he'd gathered, and soon a small but warm blaze pushed back the growing darkness. Supper was simple: dried beef, hard biscuits, and hot coffee boiled with snowmelt. Lila May wrapped her cold fingers around the tin cup, savoring its warmth. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up toward the emerging stars. Finally, Boone cleared his throat. "Reckon you're wondering what's to become of you." Lila May met his eyes steadily across the flames. "Yes, sir, I am." "Not sir," he corrected quietly. "Just Boone." He took a slow breath, and she heard the slight wheeze in his chest. "Truth is, I got no intention of keeping you as servant or wife. Got something else in mind." He paused to cough, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. When he recovered, he continued, "My lungs are going bad. Won't last past spring, I figure. Got a place up in these hills, good land, with a creek and meadow, cabin solid, got supplies laid by." His eyes met hers again. "I aim to give it to you." Lila May stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Give it to me? But why?" "Because there's someone needs looking after when I'm gone. A boy." Boone's voice softened. "Ute child? Name's Ashkey. His folks were killed 3 years back. Massacre I wouldn't be part of. Couldn't leave him to the government men, so I took him in. Been raising him since—" He prodded the fire with a stick, sending up a fresh shower of sparks. "He's a good boy, quick to learn, strong heart, but he needs someone when I'm gone, someone who'll protect him proper." His eyes found hers again. "Saw how you held yourself this morning, standing straight while that man shamed you. Saw the strength in you. Reckon you and the boy might do each other good." Lila May sat in stunned silence, trying to make sense of it all. A homestead, freely given, a secret child who needed protection. It seemed too much to take in. "How can you trust me so quick?" "You don't know me." Boone's laugh turned into another cough. When it passed, he wiped his mouth with a faded bandana. "Known plenty of folk in my time, got so I can read people fair well. You got honest eyes and a spine made of good steel. Plus," he added with a slight smile, "ain't like I got time to be picky." The fire crackled between them as Lila May considered his words. The offer was incredible, land of her own, a chance to protect a child who needed her. But the responsibility was enormous, too. "The boy, does he know about this plan?" "Not yet. Wanted to be sure first." Boone's face grew serious. "Won't force nothing on either of you, but I'm hoping you'll at least meet him, see if it might work." Night had fully fallen now, and the cold pressed closer despite the fire. Boone showed her how to arrange her bedding under the lean-to, keeping her feet toward the flames. The canvas overhead would reflect the heat back down, he explained, and the pine bough windbreak would keep the worst of the weather away. As they settled into their separate beds of blankets and furs, Lila May listened to the quiet sounds of the night, the creek's gentle murmur, the occasional pop of the fire, the soft jingling of the mules' bells as they moved in their picket line. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, its voice echoing off the snow-covered slopes. Her mind whirled with the day's events, from the public shame of the morning to this extraordinary offer. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt something like hope stirring in her heart. The morning sun had climbed higher when the sled finally crested a snow-covered ridge. Below, nestled in a protected valley, sat a sturdy log cabin. Smoke curled from its stone chimney into the crisp winter air, dancing against the backdrop of pine-covered hills. "Home," Boone said simply, guiding the mules down the gentle slope. As they drew closer, Lila May noticed movement at one of the cabin's windows. A small face appeared briefly, dark eyes watching intently, before vanishing like a shadow. Boone brought the sled to a stop near the cabin's door. "Ashkai," he called out softly, "come meet our guest." The door creaked open slowly, and a boy of about 10 years old stepped onto the porch. He wore buckskin leggings and a wool shirt that had seen better days, his black hair falling loose around his shoulders. His eyes, keen and cautious, studied Lila May with quiet intensity. "This here's Lila May," Boone said, his voice gentle. "She's come to stay with us a while." Ashki nodded once, but didn't speak. His gaze never left Lila May as she climbed down from the sled, her legs stiff from the long ride. "Let's get you settled," Boone said, lifting her bundle from the sled. Another cough shook him, and he had to pause to catch his breath. "Ashki, help with the mules." The boy moved quickly to unhitch the team, his small hands working the harness with practiced ease. Lila May watched as he led the animals toward a rough-built barn that stood a short distance from the cabin. Boone pushed open the cabin door, ushering her inside. Warmth and the scent of wood smoke wrapped around her like a blanket. The cabin was a single room with a loft above, simple but well-maintained. A pot-bellied stove squatted in one corner, while a stone fireplace dominated the opposite wall. Bunks were built against the far wall, and a sturdy table with 3 chairs stood in the center of the room. "Ain't much," Boone said, setting her bundle on the table, "but it keeps the weather out." He moved to the window, pointing out across the snow-covered yard. "Barn's got space for the mules and 2 sheep we keep. Good spring behind the cabin, never runs dry. Meadow beyond makes fine grazing come summer." Lila May took it all in. The spruce-scented air, the well-swept floor, the neat stack of firewood by the hearth. Everything spoke of care and attention despite its simplicity. "You rest a spell," Boone said, another cough building in his chest. "I need to see to some things outside." Left alone, Lila May explored the cabin more closely. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a shelf held a few battered books. A Bible lay on the table, its pages worn with use. In the loft, she could see neat piles of furs and blankets. The door opened, and Ashki slipped inside like a shadow. He carried an armload of kindling, which he stacked carefully by the stove. His movements were quick and sure, speaking of long practice. "Thank you," Lila May said softly. The boy glanced at her, then nodded again. Though he didn't speak, his eyes followed her as she moved about the cabin, taking stock of the supplies and beginning preparations for their evening meal. By late afternoon, a rich stew simmered in the iron pot while Boone rested on one of the bunks, his breathing labored. Ashki had brought in more firewood and now sat cross-legged by the stove, whittling a piece of pine with careful concentration. The sun had set, and they were finishing their supper when Boone finally spoke of what had brought them all together. "Reckon you ought to know the whole of it," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Ashki's folks, they were killed 3 years back. Raid gone wrong, though there ain't no raids that go right, if you ask me." He paused, coughing into his bandana. When he could speak again, his voice was softer. "Government's got these schools, far off east. Take Indian children, cut their hair, won't let them speak their own tongue, say they're civilizing them." The bitterness in his voice was plain. "Indian agent's been sniffing around, looking for any children not in school. If he found Ashcombe..." He left the sentence unfinished. Lila May looked at the boy, who had gone still at Boone's words. She understood now. The wariness in his eyes, the quiet way he moved, always watching. He was hiding, and Boone was his shield. "That's why you need someone," she said quietly. "Someone to keep him safe when you're gone." Boone nodded, another cough shaking his frame. "Ain't right, taking children from their people. Seen too much of that already." His eyes met hers across the table. "You understand about being treated like property, being told you ain't worth nothing. Saw that clear enough yesterday." Lila May felt Ashki's gaze on her, curious and measuring. She straightened in her chair. "Yes, I do understand that." Night had settled fully outside, and the fire cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Lila May began clearing the supper dishes, while Boone's coughing grew worse. Finally, he retreated to his bunk, exhaustion plain on his face. Ashki helped her wash the dishes in silence, but she noticed how he stayed close, watching her movements. When the kitchen was clean, she saw him trying to hide his yawns. "Time for bed, I think," she said gently. The boy glanced at Boone, who nodded from his bunk. Without a word, Ashki climbed the ladder to the loft. Lila May followed, carrying a lamp to light his way. In the loft, Ashki burrowed into his nest of blankets and furs. Lila May tucked the covers around him, her movements careful and slow. His dark eyes watched her, still wary, but perhaps a little less so than before. Below, Boone's coughing echoed in the quiet cabin. Ashki's face tightened at the sound, and Lila May saw worry flash across his young features. She understood then. This boy had already lost one family. Now he faced losing another. She smoothed the blanket one last time, her heart aching for this child who had endured so much. In the lamplight, his face looked very young and vulnerable, despite his careful silence. Dawn broke cold and clear over the snow-covered valley. Lila May woke to the sound of Boone's coughing and the crackle of a freshly lit fire. Through the cabin's frosted windows, she could see the pale winter sun painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. "Morning comes early up here," Boone said, his voice rough from coughing. He stood at the iron stove, stirring a pot of coffee. "Chores won't wait." Ashki was already dressed and heading out the door, a wooden bucket swinging in his hand. Lila May quickly pulled on her boots and the buffalo coat Boone had given her. "I'll help with the water," she said, reaching for another bucket. The creek ran swift and clear, about 50 paces behind the cabin, protected from freezing by its rapid flow. Ashki showed her where stones had been placed to make stepping down to the water easier. Together, they filled their buckets and carried them back to the cabin. It took 4 trips to fill the barrel that stood near the stove. "Sheep need feeding," Boone said when they returned with the last load. He pointed to a small barn. "Ashki knows how much hay they get." In the barn, 2 woolly ewes greeted them with soft bleats. While Ashki forked hay into their manger, Lila May noticed Boone's parka hanging on a peg, a long tear visible in one sleeve. "That needs mending," she said, taking it down. The tear wasn't too bad. She could fix it before the cold air found its way inside. Back in the cabin, she found needle and thread in her bundle and set to work while Boone and Ashki finished the morning chores. The parka's hide was thick but well worn, and her needle moved steadily through it. "Much obliged," Boone said when she handed him the mended coat. He studied her stitches with approval. "Reckon you'll need more skills than sewing to make it up here, though." He led her outside, Ashki trailing behind them like a shadow. Near the edge of the clearing, Boone stopped and pulled a length of wire from his pocket. "Time you learned to set a snare," he said. "Can't live on coffee and beans alone?" His big hands moved deliberately as he showed her how to shape the wire into a loop and secure it to a flexible sapling. "Rabbits use the same paths over and over," he explained, pointing to tiny tracks in the snow. "Set your snare here, where the trail runs between these bushes." Lila May watched carefully as he demonstrated, then tried it herself. Her first attempt was clumsy, but Boone nodded encouragingly. "You'll get the hang of it," he said, then bent double with another coughing fit. Back inside, they sat around the table with steaming cups of coffee. The morning's activity had worn on Boone. His breathing was labored, and his face looked drawn. "There's something else you need to know," he said when he could speak again. "Up in the hills, about an hour's ride north, there's an old mining shack. Nobody uses it now, but I keep important papers there." He paused to catch his breath. "Land documents, mostly. Treaty papers showing where the Ute boundaries lay before the government moved them out. Proves this homestead sits on land that was properly traded for." Lila May listened intently, understanding there was more to this than just old papers. "Why keep them hidden away?" "Because..." Boone started to answer, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted him. They all turned to look out the window. A single rider was making his way up the trail, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. "Railroad man," Boone said grimly. "Recognize the coat." The rider dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. He was a thin man in a dark wool coat, carrying a leather document case. Boone met him at the door. "State your business." The man pulled an envelope from his case. "Notice from the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company," he said crisply. "This land has been designated for the new spur line. All residents must vacate by spring thaw." Boone took the letter but didn't open it. "This is legal homestead land," he said, his voice tight. "Established under treaty with the Ute Nation and confirmed by territorial court." "The railroad's survey says different." The man's eyes flickered to Lila May and Ashki, who stood in the doorway. Something like disapproval crossed his face. "You'll be compensated fair market value, of course." "Not selling," Boone said flatly. Another cough shook him, and he had to grab the doorframe to stay upright. The railroad man's expression hardened. "This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Boone. The railroad's coming through one way or another. Best clear out before spring." He touched the brim of his hat and turned back to his horse. They watched him ride away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the winter stillness. Inside the cabin, Boone sank heavily into a chair, his breathing ragged. "Those papers in the mining shack," he said when he could speak again. "They prove this land was legally traded for. Show the original boundaries, with signatures from both territorial officials and Ute leaders." He looked at Lila May, his eyes intense despite his exhaustion. "We need to fetch them before the heavy snows come. Once the passes fill in, we won't get through till spring." "And by then it might be too late," Lila May finished. She understood now why he'd been so urgent about teaching her the land's ways. This wasn't just about surviving, it was about protecting a home. Protecting Ashki. Ashki had moved to stand beside Boone's chair, one small hand resting on the big man's shoulder. His face was worried as he watched Boone struggle for breath. Evening settled over the valley, bringing with it a rising wind that rattled the cabin's shutters. Lila May added wood to the fire while Boone rested, his coughing worse than before. The railroad's letter lay unopened on the table, but its threat hung in the air like smoke. As she prepared their supper, Lila May could hear the wind growing stronger, whistling through the pine trees that surrounded the cabin. Snow would come soon. They all knew it. Whatever they planned to do about those papers in the mining shack, it would have to be done quickly. The shutters rattled again, harder this time, as if emphasizing the urgency of their situation. Lila May glanced at Boone, who sat slumped in his chair, and at Ashki, who watched them both with worried eyes. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight they needed rest and warmth and food. She stirred the pot of stew simmering on the stove, adding a pinch more salt. Outside, the wind continued to rise, carrying with it the promise of snow. Dawn broke pale and cold over the mountain valley. Lila May pulled her buffalo coat tighter as she stepped out of the cabin into the crisp morning air. Frost sparkled on every surface, making the world look like it had been dusted with diamond chips. Boone was already at the barn, his breath forming clouds in the cold. "First things first," he said, gesturing to the mule team. "Got to harness them proper, or we'll have trouble on the trail." He showed her how to check each leather strap, explaining as his weathered hands moved with practiced ease. "See here? Buckle's got to sit just so, or it'll rub them raw." The mules stood patient and steady, their long ears twitching occasionally as Boone adjusted their gear. "Now you try," he said, stepping back. Lila May approached the second mule, running her hands along the leather as Boone had shown her. The straps were stiff with cold, but she worked them carefully, making sure each buckle sat right. "Good," Boone nodded. "You've got a gentle touch. They appreciate that." Inside the barn, they loaded the sled with supplies: thick furs for bedding, A small canvas tent, ropes, and food enough for several days. Dried meat, hard biscuits, coffee, and beans. Boone packed it all with careful precision, showing her how to tie everything down so it wouldn't shift. "I'm coming too." Ashki's quiet voice made them both turn. The boy stood in the barn doorway, his face set with determination. Boone shook his head. "Too dangerous with the weather turning." "I know the trails," Ashki insisted. "Better than you in the snow." He switched to Ute, speaking rapidly, his hands moving in emphasis. Boone listened, then sighed. "He says his people used these mountains in all seasons. Says he can read the weather signs better than any of us." Another cough shook him, as if proving the boy's point about his condition. Lila May watched the exchange, seeing the worry in Ashki's eyes as he looked at Boone. The boy wasn't just being stubborn. He was afraid for his guardian. "Might be wise to have him along," she said softly. "3 sets of eyes are better than 2. Boone studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Reckon you're right." He turned to Ashki. "Get your warm things, and mind you stay close to the sled when we're moving." The trail leading into the hills was narrow, barely wide enough for the sled. Pine trees pressed close on either side, their branches heavy with snow. The mules picked their way carefully, their hooves crunching through the crusty surface. Twice they had to stop, the sled runners frozen to the ground. Boone showed them how to break the ice free without damaging the wood. "Got to be gentle about it," he explained, demonstrating with the handle of his axe. "Too much force will split the runner, then we're really in trouble." By midday, the gray sky had grown darker, and the wind carried a bite that hadn't been there earlier. They pushed on, climbing steadily into the hills. Ashki walked ahead sometimes, reading signs in the snow that Lila May couldn't see. He would stop, look at the sky, then point them toward what he said was the safest path. When evening approached, Boone called a halt in a hollow protected by a stand of thick pines. The trees broke the wind, and their branches formed a kind of natural roof overhead. They worked together to set up the small tent and gather firewood before the light failed completely. Lila May got a small fire going, while Boone showed Ashki how to brush down the mules and make sure they were comfortable for the night. The flames cast dancing shadows on the snow as she laid out their simple supper, hard biscuits and strips of dried venison. They huddled close to the fire, grateful for its warmth. Ashki sat cross-legged, watching the flames with thoughtful eyes. After a while, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. "For you," he said softly, holding it out to Lila May. "For luck." It was a small wooden bird, carefully carved from pale pine wood. The details were simple but precise, wings folded against its body, head tilted as if listening. Lila May took it gently, touched by the gift. "Thank you," she said, running her finger over the smooth surface. "Did you make this?" Ashki nodded. "Like the ones that come in spring. They sing when the snow melts." Boone watched their exchange with approval, but his expression soon turned serious as he studied the darkening sky. "Storm's moving in faster than I thought," he said, his voice rough with concern. "We'll need to push hard tomorrow, get to that shack before it hits proper." The wind picked up, making the fire flutter. Lila May tucked the wooden bird safely in her coat pocket as they finished their meal. One by one, small snowflakes began to drift down, catching the firelight before vanishing in the flames. "Best get some rest," Boone said, banking the fire for the night. "Tomorrow won't be easy." They crowded into the small tent, wrapped in furs against the cold. Outside, the snow fell steadily now, dusting their campfire with white. Lila May could hear the mules shuffling in their makeshift shelter, and the soft whisper of snow against canvas. Her hand found the wooden bird in her pocket, and she held it tight, hoping Ashki's luck would see them through whatever tomorrow might bring. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was the orange glow of their dying fire through the tent flap. snowflakes swirling like stars in its light. The morning brought deeper snow, turning their progress into a crawl. Each step the mules took sank past their knees, and the sled carved heavy tracks behind them. Lila May walked alongside, her boots filling with powder despite Boone's leather wrappings around her ankles. Ashki moved ahead, testing the depth with a long pole. The boy's shoulders were dusted white, making him look like a snow spirit in the dim morning light. Every few yards, he would stop and point out hidden obstacles that could damage the sled. "There," he called, gesturing to their left. "Better go around that way." But the warning came too late. A hidden rock caught the right runner, and the sled tipped with a sickening crack. Their supplies shifted dangerously, held only by Boone's careful rope work. "Whoa there," Boone called to the mules, his voice rough with cold. He examined the damaged runner, running his hand along the splintered wood. "Got to fix this proper, or we won't make it much further." Lila May helped him unload enough supplies to right the sled. Her fingers ached with cold as they worked, but she kept moving, knowing stillness was dangerous in such weather. "Hand me that rawhide," Boone said, pointing to his pack. He showed her how to soak the strips in snowmelt, making them pliable enough to bind the cracked wood. "Got to wrap it tight, see? Cross it over like so." They worked together, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Ashki kept the mules calm, speaking to them softly in Ute, while Boone and Lila May repaired the runner. By midday, they reached a creek that cut across their path. Ice stretched from bank to bank, its surface deceptively smooth under a dusting of snow. "We test it first," Boone said firmly, breaking out long poles for each of them. "Hit hard. Listen for hollow sounds." They spread out, striking the ice and listening. The sound echoed through the frozen valley like gunshots. Lila May watched Boone's face, learning to read the subtle changes in his expression as he interpreted each sound. "Seems solid enough," he said finally, "but we take it slow, one mule at a time." They unhitched the team, planning to lead them across separately. The first mule made it safely, picking its way carefully across the ice. But as the second mule reached the middle, a sharp crack split the air. The ice gave way with a sound like breaking glass. The mule plunged through up to its chest, screaming in panic. Its hooves churned the freezing water, sending up an icy spray. "Quick now!" Boone shouted, already moving. "Get the ropes!" Lila May ran to the sled, her heart pounding. She grabbed the coiled ropes while Boone tried to calm the thrashing animal. The cold water soaked through her sleeves as she helped him loop the rope around the mule's chest. "Pull together," Boone ordered, his voice strained. "Steady now." They heaved, muscles burning with effort. The mule fought to find purchase on the broken ice, its eyes rolling white with fear. Water ran off its coat, freezing almost instantly in the bitter air. "Ashki," Lila May called between breaths. "We need a fire ready. Quick as you can." The boy was already gathering wood, his small hands working surely with flint and steel. By the time they dragged the mule free, a small flame flickered on the bank. They worked frantically to dry the animal, using spare blankets to rub its legs and chest. Boone's cough grew worse with the exertion, but he didn't stop until the mule's coat was mostly dry. "Could lose him to the cold if we're not careful," he said, leading the shivering animal close to Ashki's fire. They all huddled there, warming their hands and watching the mule for signs of distress. The delay cost them precious hours. The sky had grown darker by the time they hitched up again and continued their journey. Snow fell more heavily now, limiting visibility to a few yards ahead. "There," Boone said finally, pointing through the swirling white. "The mining shack." Lila May squinted, making out a dark shape against the whiteness. As they drew closer, she saw it was a sagging structure, its roof heavy with snow. One wall leaned dangerously, and half the building seemed buried in drifts. Inside, the air was still and cold. Their lantern light revealed a cluttered space. Rusty tools hung on walls, Empty crates gathered dust in corners. Near the back, under a heavy tarp, sat an old trunk. Boone moved toward it slowly, as if approaching something that might bite. "Should be in here," he said, pulling back the tarp. The trunk's leather was cracked with age, its brass fittings green with verdigris. Lila May helped him open it, careful of the creaking hinges. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, they found the treaty papers, carefully preserved maps and documents showing the legal boundaries of the land. But underneath, something else caught her eye. A bundle of letters, their edges worn soft with handling. As she lifted them, one fell open, revealing official military letterhead. The words jumped out at her: desertion in the face of duty, and refusal to carry out direct orders during the Clear Creek operation. She looked up at Boone, questions filling her mind. His face had grown still, the lantern light deepening the lines around his eyes. "You were cavalry," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Boone nodded slowly. "Was," he agreed, his voice heavy with memory. "Until I saw what some men called duty wasn't nothing but murder. Couldn't be part of that. Wouldn't." The letters told a story of orders refused, of a massacre prevented, of a soldier who chose conscience over command. Lila May looked at this quiet man with new understanding, seeing how the weight of that choice still sat on his shoulders. They carefully wrapped the treaty papers back in oilcloth, and Lila May found herself handling them with extra reverence. These weren't just property lines on paper. They were proof of promises made, of boundaries that needed defending. She understood now why Boone had hidden them here, and why he'd been so careful about who he trusted with their location. The snow continued to fall outside the shack's single window, and the wind had picked up, carrying a hollow moan. But inside, in the small circle of lantern light, something shifted between them, a deepening of trust, born of secrets shared and understood. The wind howled outside the mining shack, but inside, the old walls held firm enough to keep out the worst of the cold. Lila May added wood to their small fire, watching the shadows dance across Boone's weathered face as he sat heavily on an overturned crate. "Reckon you deserve the whole truth," he said, his voice barely carrying over the storm's moan. "Been carrying it long enough." Ashki curled up in his blankets near the fire, but his dark eyes stayed fixed on Boone, as if he too had waited to hear this story. "Was stationed at Fort Collins," Boone began, his hands clasped together. "Scouting mostly, tracking movements of different bands. Some peaceful, some not, but most just trying to live on what land was left to them." He paused, coughing into his sleeve. Lila May handed him a cup of hot coffee, settling onto another crate to listen. "Orders came down one morning, clear out a winter camp near Clear Creek. Command said they were hostiles." His voice grew tight. "But I'd scouted that camp. Was nothing but families there. Women, children, elders too old to travel far." The fire popped, sending sparks up the crooked chimney. Outside, the wind's voice seemed to drop, as if nature itself leaned in to hear. "Captain wanted us to go in at dawn, when they'd still be sleeping." Boone's scarred hands tightened around his cup. "Said it would be cleaner that way, but there ain't nothing clean about killing innocent folk in their sleep." "What did you do?" Lila May asked softly. "Only thing I could. Walked into that camp the night before, warned them, helped them scatter into the hills." He looked down at his hands. "Then I walked away from the fort, knowing I could never go back. Deserted, they called it. Made me a wanted man." "You did right," Lila May said firmly. Boone's eyes met hers, something like gratitude flickering in their depths. "Maybe so. But doing right comes with its own price. Been watching my back ever since, trying to make up for the things I did do before that day." They sat in silence for a while, each lost in thought as the fire burned low. Finally, Ashki spoke up from his blankets. "Is that why you helped me?" "Partly," Boone admitted, "but mostly because no child should be torn from their people, Their ways. Seen too much of that already. Lila May added more wood to the fire, understanding now why Boone had chosen this remote place, why he'd hidden Ashki away from those who would send him to a distant school. Every choice had been an act of protection, of making right what he could. They slept fitfully that night, the wind's voice a constant companion. Morning came with startling brightness, sunlight streaming through the shack's single window and reflecting off the new-fallen snow until it hurt to look at. "Snow's got a crust on it," Boone observed, testing the surface with his boot. "Might make traveling easier, if it holds." They packed quickly, eager to start the journey home. The treaty papers were secured in Boone's coat, close to his chest. The mules seemed refreshed after their night's rest, though the one that had fallen through the ice still moved stiffly. As they drove the sled across the glittering landscape, Ashki rode beside Lila May, his small shoulder occasionally brushing against her arm. The boy seemed to be gathering his courage to speak. "Miss Lila May?" he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, child. Will you stay with us? Even if—" He glanced ahead at Boone's broad back, then down at his own hands. "Even if Boone goes away?" The question caught at her heart. She looked at this brave, quiet boy who had already lost so much, and knew there was only one answer she could give. "Yes," she said softly but firmly. "I'll stay with you, Ashki. That's a promise." He nodded once, relief visible in the softening of his shoulders. They rode on in companionable silence, the sled runners whispering over the crusty snow. The journey back took longer than expected, the short winter day fading into dusk before they caught sight of the cabin. Smoke still rose from the chimney. They had banked the fire well before leaving, and the sight of it brought a collective sigh of relief from all three travelers. After tending to the mules and bringing in their supplies, Boone took out a small tin box from beneath a loose floorboard. With careful movements, he placed the treaty papers inside. "These prove our right to be here," he said, securing the box's latch. "Railroad men can write all the letters they want, but this land was marked out fair and square in the treaty." Lila May nodded, watching as he replaced the floorboard. Another secret shared, another trust given. That evening, they sat around the table sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The usual weight of worry seemed lighter somehow, replaced by a rare sense of peace. Even Boone's cough seemed less severe. "Christmas is coming soon," Ashki mentioned suddenly, breaking a long, comfortable silence. "So it is," Boone agreed, a small smile touching his lips. "Reckon we ought to do something about that." "Could make some decorations," Lila May suggested, thinking of the pine boughs she had seen near the creek. "Maybe string some berries, if we can find them." "Used to have a star," Ashki said, "made of tin, but it got crushed last winter when the roof leaked." "Well now," Boone said, "might be we can make a new one. Still got some tin left from patching the roof." They talked on into the evening, making plans for the holiday to come. Outside, the wind had died down to a gentle whisper, and stars pricked through the darkening sky. Inside, the lamp's warm glow fell on three faces united by choice rather than chance, by promises made and kept, by a shared understanding of what it meant to protect what mattered most. The days leading up to Christmas brought a gentle rhythm to the cabin. Pine boughs, gathered from nearby trees, filled the small home with their fresh scent. Lila May showed Ashki how to string red winter berries they'd found clinging to branches near the creek, their fingers working carefully with needle and thread. "My mama used to make these every Christmas," she said, demonstrating how to pierce the berries without crushing them. Said they looked like tiny lanterns when the firelight hit them. Ashki's nimble fingers quickly mastered the task. "We had special days, too," he shared quietly. "Different ones, but there were always stories and good things to eat." The cabin took on a festive air as they hung the decorations. Strands of berries draped across the window frames caught the winter light, and pine branches lined the mantel above the fireplace. Even Boone seemed lighter in spirit, though his cough lingered. In the evenings, while Boone worked at his small workbench, Layla May took stock of their supplies. Flour was scarce, barely enough to last until spring, but she had found a jar of molasses tucked away in the back of a cupboard. The discovery sparked a memory of Christmas cakes her grandmother used to make. "Might not be as fancy," she said, measuring the precious flour carefully, "but it'll do for celebrating." The cake baked slowly in the wood stove, filling the cabin with a sweet, warm smell that made even Boone look up from his work. He had been carefully carving something, keeping it hidden whenever Ashki came near. The day before Christmas arrived with fresh snow. While Layla May prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Boone finally revealed what he'd been working on, a smooth wooden whistle, carefully shaped and polished. "Been a while since we had music around here," he said, presenting it to Ashki. The boy's eyes widened as he took the gift, turning it over in his hands. "It's beautiful," he whispered, running his fingers along the smooth surface. That evening, they gathered by the fire. The cake sat on a tin plate on the table, saved for Christmas Day. Pine logs crackled in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent flakes. "Tell us a story, Miss Layla May," Ashki requested, still holding his new whistle carefully. She thought for a moment, then began sharing tales of Christmases from her childhood, of paper chains and popcorn strings, of carols sung in the little church back in Kansas. Ashki listened intently, then offered his own story about winter celebrations with his people, his voice growing stronger as he spoke of dances and songs that honored the changing seasons. Boone sat quietly in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But halfway through one of Ashki's stories, a coughing fit seized him. He doubled over, his whole frame shaking with the force of it. Layla May quickly poured him water while Ashki watched with worried eyes. When the fit passed, Boone straightened up slowly. "Don't fret," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Just the cold air is all." To break the tension, Ashki lifted his whistle to his lips. The first few notes were uncertain, but soon a clear, sweet tune emerged. Something simple but touching, like birdsong on a spring morning. Boone's smile returned as he listened, and even his breathing seemed to ease. The fire burned low as they sat together, sharing the warmth and peace of the moment. Layla May looked around at this unlikely family, the quiet mountain man with his gentle heart, the brave boy who had survived so much, the cabin that had become a sanctuary. For the first time since she could remember, she felt truly at home. Snow continued falling through the night, and Christmas morning dawned bright and still. Layla May woke early to stoke the fire and put on coffee. Soon Ashki appeared from his bed in the loft, and Boone emerged from his room, moving slowly but steadily. They shared the cake for breakfast, each savoring small bites of the rare treat. Ashki played his whistle again, the notes stronger and more confident than the night before. Even the mules in the barn seemed to prick up their ears at the sound. "Best get to the animals," Boone said when they'd finished eating. "Christmas or no, they need tending." Together they made their way through the fresh snow to the barn. The sheep greeted them with soft bleats, and the mules stamped their feet, eager for their morning feed. Steam rose from the animals' backs as they worked, spreading fresh hay and breaking ice from the water trough. When the chores were done, Layla May stood alone on the cabin's porch. The morning sun caught the snow-covered hills, making them sparkle like diamond dust. A chickadee landed on a nearby branch, shaking snow from the pine needles. She drew in a deep breath of the crisp air, feeling something unfamiliar but welcome expanding in her chest. Hope, she realized. Hope for this place, for the boy who needed her, for the good man who had given her a chance at a new life. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew in her heart that she had found where she belonged. The sound of Ashki's whistle drifted out from the cabin, accompanied by the soft thud of Boone's boots as he moved about inside. Lila May smiled, letting the music and the peace of the morning wash over her as she gazed out at the pristine white hills stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The crunch of hoofbeats in frozen snow jerked Lila May from sleep. Dawn hadn't yet touched the eastern hills, and the cabin's interior lay wrapped in darkness. She sat up on her narrow cot, straining to listen. "Someone's coming." Boone's gravelly whisper carried from the window. He stood there, a dark shape against the frosted glass, rifle in hand. More hoofbeats approached, accompanied by the jingle of tack and murmur of voices. Lila May's heart clenched as she recognized one particular voice, harsh, full of spite. "Calvin," she breathed. Boone's massive shoulders stiffened. "Get Ashki under the floor," he ordered quietly. "Quick now." Lila May hurried to the loft ladder. Above, Ashki was already awake, his dark eyes wide in the dim light. She helped him down, then lifted the loose floorboard near the hearth, a hiding spot Boone had shown them weeks ago. The boy slipped into the cramped space without a word, silent as a shadow. The riders pulled up outside, their horses' breath steaming in the pre-dawn cold. Boots thudded on frozen ground. Someone pounded on the cabin door. "Boone! Get out here, you squatter!" Calvin's voice cut through the thin walls. Lila May counted at least 5 separate voices muttering outside. Railroad toughs, by the sound of them. She moved to stand beside Boone, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "Stay back from the door," Boone warned, then called out, "This is legal property, Carter. You've got no business here." "Legal?" Calvin's laugh held no humor. "Railroad says different. Come on out, or we'll smoke you out." Boone opened the door, filling its frame with his bulk. The bitter wind swept in, carrying the smell of tobacco and horse sweat. In the weak light of the men's lanterns, Lila May could see Calvin sitting his horse, surrounded by 4 rough-looking riders. Her former husband's eyes found her in the cabin's shadows. His lip curled. "Well, if it ain't my warmed-over Charity. Keeping the mountain man's bed warm, are you?" Lila May lifted her chin, but said nothing. Boone's grip tightened on his rifle. "Clear out, Carter," Boone growled. "This land's protected by treaty." "That so?" Calvin swung down from his saddle. "Show us this treaty, then." "You know I won't." One of the toughs circled toward the barn, lantern swinging. Another dismounted, hand resting on his pistol grip. Calvin stepped closer, snow crunching under his boots. "Last chance, Boone. Hand over the paper, or things get ugly." Boone's answer was to level his rifle, but before he could speak, a coughing fit seized him. Deep, racking coughs that bent him double. Calvin lunged forward, grabbing for the weapon. The rifle cracked against skulls as Boone swung it like a club, fighting through his cough. 2 men went down in the snow, but there were too many, and Boone's strength was failing. They wrestled him to his knees while Calvin strode into the cabin. "No!" Lila May moved to block him, but he shoved her aside. "Where is it?" Calvin tore through the cabin, pulling out drawers, dumping their contents. He found the tin box under Boone's bed and smashed it open. The treaty papers spilled out like fallen leaves. Outside, orange light bloomed. The smell of smoke filled the air. "Barn's lit," someone shouted. Lila May ran to the door. Flames already climbed the barn's wooden walls, turning the snow to steam. The sheep bleated in terror. The mules kicked at their stalls. "Stop!" she screamed. "The animals!" But the toughs were already mounting up, the precious treaty papers clutched in Calvin's fist. He paused in his saddle, sneering down at Boone, who lay coughing in the bloody snow. "Mighty peaceful man now, ain't you?" Calvin spat. "Railroad gets what railroad wants. Clear out by week's end, or we'll burn more than the barn." They rode off, hoofbeats fading into the darkness. The barn's flames painted the snow in shades of hell. Lila May ran to Boone. His breath came in wet gasps, and blood flecked his beard. Together they staggered inside, where she helped him to his bed. Behind them, the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks. "Ashki!" Boone wheezed. "Get Ashki!" Lila May lifted the floorboard. The boy emerged, shaking but unharmed. He took one look at Boone and grabbed the water dipper. "Easy now," Lila May murmured, helping Boone drink. "Easy." The mountain man's eyes were glazed with fever. More blood stained his lips. Outside, the barn burned down to embers, taking with it their hay, their tools, their hope of lasting through winter. But worse by far was the loss of the treaty, their only proof of rightful claim to this land. Dawn finally broke over the eastern hills, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of rose and ash. Lila May sat beside Boone's bed, watching him breathe, while Ashki huddled close. The cabin felt colder somehow, despite the fire she'd built up. Their sanctuary had been violated, their peace shattered. But as she watched Boone's labored breathing, Lila May felt something harden inside her. Not hatred, but determination. They would find a way through this. They had to. This place, this family they'd built. It was worth fighting for. Dawn light filtered through the cabin's frosted windows, casting weak shadows across Boone's pale face. His breathing came rough and shallow, each intake of air ending in a wet rattle. Lila May pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, her own exhaustion forgotten as she tended his fever. "More water," she murmured, and Ashki darted to refill the tin cup from their bucket. Outside, wisps of smoke still rose from the blackened ruins of the barn. The air held the acrid smell of burnt timber, a constant reminder of their loss. But it wasn't the barn that worried Lila May most. It was the stolen treaty. Without it, they had no proof this land was rightfully theirs. She checked Boone's bandages where the men had struck him, gentle fingers probing for fresh bleeding. His skin burned hot beneath her touch. When his eyes flickered open, they were glazed with fever. "The treaty," he rasped, "must get it back." "Hush now," Lila May soothed. "Save your strength." But she knew he was right. Without that document, everything they'd built here would be lost. The railroad would take the land, and Ashki would be sent to some distant boarding school. She couldn't let that happen. Rising from Boone's bedside, Lila May walked to the window. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow, and in the distance, dark clouds promised more to come. If she was going to act, it had to be now. "Ashki," she called softly, "help me saddle the mule." The boy looked up from where he sat cross-legged near the hearth. "I'm coming too." "No." Lila May's voice was firm, but gentle. "I need you here, watching over Boone. Can you do that for me?" Ashki's face fell, but he nodded. Together they walked to where the remaining mule stood in the shelter of a lean-to, the only structure that hadn't burned. The animal's breath steamed in the cold air as Lila May showed Ashki how to mix pine needle tea for Boone's cough. "Give him small sips when he wakes," she instructed, checking the mule's cinch one final time. "Keep the fire strong, and don't open the door to anyone but me." "What if the bad men come back?" Ashki's voice was barely a whisper. Lila May knelt in the snow before him, meeting his worried gaze. "You remember the hiding spot under the floor? Use it if you have to. But I'll be back before dark, I promise." The boy threw his arms around her neck, surprising her with the fierceness of his embrace. She hugged him back just as tight, then mounted the mule with determination settling into her bones. The ride into town took hours through the drifting snow. Lila May's buffalo hide coat kept the worst of the cold at bay, but her thoughts remained troubled. What exactly did she plan to do once she found Calvin and his men? She had no weapon, no authority, nothing but her own conviction that what they'd done was wrong. The sun hung low in the western sky by the time she rode down the town's main street. A few people hurried along the wooden sidewalks, ducking their heads against the wind. Most ignored her, though some stared openly at the sight of a lone woman riding in such weather. She dismounted outside the livery stable, her legs stiff from the cold. The stable boy took her mule with wide eyes, but said nothing. Lila May straightened her coat and walked toward the saloon, where lamplight already glowed in the gathering dusk. Voices and piano music spilled out onto the street. Through the grimy windows, she could see several men gathered around the bar, including Calvin and his railroad toughs. Her husband's cruel laugh carried through the swinging doors. Lila May paused, her heart hammering. Everything in her upbringing told her this was no place for a respectable woman. But then she thought of Boone's fever, of Ashki's frightened eyes, of the smoldering ruins of their barn. Drawing a deep breath, she pushed through the doors. The piano music stuttered to a stop. Conversations died. Every head turned to stare as Lila May walked across the sawdust-strewn floor, her boots striking loud in the sudden silence. She stopped a few paces from where Calvin leaned against the bar. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled off her gloves. "I've come for the treaty papers you stole." Laughter erupted around her. Calvin's face split in a mocking grin as he turned to face her fully. "Well, look who's got sand in her craw. Did that mountain man send you to beg?" "Boone didn't send me." Lila May's voice carried clear and strong despite her racing pulse. "He's too sick to ride. Thanks to you and your friends, I'm here because what you did was wrong. And you know it." "Wrong." Calvin pushed away from the bar, whiskey sloshing in his glass. "Wrong was that deserter thinking he could keep railroad land. Wrong was you thinking you could play house with him and that Indian brat." More laughter from the men around them. Lila May felt her cheeks burn, but she held her ground. "That land belongs to the Ute people, and you know it. The treaty proves it." "Treaty's gone." Calvin drained his glass and set it down hard. "Burned it myself this morning. Nothing left but ashes, just like that barn." Lila May's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to stand straighter. "Then you've committed more than theft. You've broken faith with people who trusted you to honor your word. Is that the kind of man you are, Calvin? One who burns proof of his lies?" The laughter died. Calvin's face darkened as he stepped closer. "You watch your mouth, woman. You ain't got no right to question me." "I've got every right." Lila May didn't back away. "Just like those people had a right to their land before men like you decided papers could be burned and promises broken." Someone muttered, "Amen," from the back of the room. Calvin's eyes darted around, noticing how some men were no longer smiling. The railroad toughs shifted uncomfortably. "You're making a fool of yourself," Calvin growled. "Go on back to your mountain man. What's left of him? Railroad's gonna have that land, treaty or no treaty?" "Maybe so." Lila May's voice remained steady. "But everyone here will know how you got it. Is that what you want, Calvin? To be remembered as a man who burns barns in the night and steals from sick men?" The saloon's batwing doors creaked as more people filtered in from the street. Word had spread like wildfire through the small town. Lila May Carter was standing up to her husband and the railroad men in broad daylight. "What's all this about?" came a voice from the doorway. Mrs. Peterson, the milliner's wife, stepped inside, followed by several other townsfolk. They gathered near the walls, watching the confrontation with wary interest. Lila May seized her chance. "Someone fetch Preacher Roberts," she called out. "Let him hear what these men have done." A young boy darted out the door. The crowd grew larger, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the smoky room. Calvin's face had turned an ugly shade of red, but he said nothing as they waited. Minutes later, Preacher Roberts arrived, his gray hair windblown. Behind him came Colonel Marcus Hayes, a decorated Civil War veteran who now served on the town council. The colonel's presence commanded immediate respect. Men straightened their backs and removed their hats. "Mrs. Carter," the preacher said kindly, "what seems to be the trouble?" Lila May's voice carried clear through the hushed room. "These men burned down Elijah Boone's barn and stole a legal treaty document that proves his land rights. The railroad agent claims the land is theirs, but that treaty shows it belongs to the Ute people, with Boone as their legal tenant." The railroad agent, a thin man named Harrison, shifted uncomfortably. "Now see here. Is this true?" Colonel Hayes cut in, his steel-gray eyes sweeping the room. "The burning and the theft?" "They did it in the night," Lila May continued. "Left Boone beaten and sick. Calvin here admits he burned the treaty himself." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several people shook their heads in disgust. "That land belongs to the railroad," Harrison protested, but his voice wavered. "We have surveys." "Surveys don't override treaties," Colonel Hayes interrupted. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of command. "I fought alongside Ute scouts in the war. Their people were promised certain lands would be protected. If there's a valid treaty, it takes precedence." More whispers swept the room. Harrison tugged at his collar, glancing nervously at Calvin and the other toughs. The colonel stepped forward, boots striking loud on the wooden floor. "I propose a simple solution. Return the treaty now, or I'll ride to Fort Collins myself and bring the territorial marshal back to investigate. Burning buildings, theft of legal documents. Those are serious charges, gentlemen." Harrison's face had gone pale. He reached slowly into his coat and withdrew a leather folder. "The treaty isn't burned," he admitted. "Carter was supposed to destroy it, but—" "Give it here," Colonel Hayes demanded, holding out his hand. The railroad agent hesitated only a moment before surrendering the folder. The colonel examined the contents briefly, then nodded to Lila May. "This appears to be legitimate. Mrs. Carter, I believe this belongs to Mr. Boone." Lila May stepped forward and accepted the treaty with trembling hands. She tucked it carefully inside her coat, close to her heart. Someone in the crowd started slow clapping. Others joined in, and soon the sound filled the saloon. Calvin stood forgotten by the bar, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "Ain't you got someplace else to be?" old Tom Wheeler called out. "Seems to me a man who'd burned down his neighbor's barn ain't welcome here no more." "Get out of our town," another voice added. More joined in, until the message was clear. Calvin grabbed his hat and stormed toward the door, shouldering roughly past Lila May. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "No," Lila May replied calmly. "I reckon I won't." The railroad toughs followed Calvin out, leaving Harrison standing alone. The agent cleared his throat awkwardly. "The railroad will, of course, respect the treaty's provisions," he mumbled, before making his own hasty exit. Preacher Roberts stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Lila May's shoulder. "You did right, standing up for truth. Do you need an escort home? It's getting dark." "I'll see her safely back," Colonel Hayes offered, "and tomorrow I'll ride out to check on Boone. Make sure there's no more trouble." Lila May felt tears threatening, but held them back. "Thank you," she managed. "All of you." As she walked out into the snowy evening, the treaty secure against her chest, townspeople nodded respectfully. For the first time since that bitter morning when Calvin had tried to trade her away, Lila May felt her dignity fully restored. She had faced down her tormentors and won, not with violence, but with truth and courage. The mule was waiting at the livery stable, ready for the ride home to Boone and Ashkai, to her family. Lila May guided her mule through deepening snow, the treaty paper pressed against her chest beneath layers of wool and fur. The setting sun painted the western clouds in shades of purple and gold, casting long shadows across the pristine drifts. Her breath formed clouds in the frigid air as she urged the tired animal forward. The familiar shape of the cabin emerged from the gathering darkness, a welcoming glow spilling from its windows. Before she could even dismount, the door burst open. Ashki bounded through the snow, his dark eyes wide with worry and hope. "Did you get it?" he called out, reaching for the mule's bridle. "Are you all right?" "I got it," she assured him, swinging down from the saddle. Her legs were stiff from the cold ride. "How's Boone?" "He's awake. Been asking for you." Together they led the mule to shelter, working quickly to remove the tack and rub the animal down. Only then did Lila May stamp the snow from her boots and step into the cabin's warmth. Boone lay propped up on his cot near the fire, his face pale but alert, his eyes fixed on her immediately. "You made it back safe," he said, his voice rough from coughing. Lila May unfastened her coat and drew out the leather folder. "The treaty's safe," she said, placing it in his weathered hands. "Colonel Hayes made them give it back. They won't trouble us again." Boone's fingers trembled slightly as he gripped the document. "Thank you," he whispered. "I never meant for you to face such danger." "Family looks after its own," she replied simply, moving to stir the pot of stew hanging over the fire. Ashki brought bowls and spoons, setting them out on the small table. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows in soft whispers. They ate together in comfortable silence, sharing looks of relief and gratitude. The treaty lay on the table between them, a simple piece of paper that meant everything: their home, their safety, their future together. As the evening deepened into night, they gathered close to the fire's warmth. Boone's breathing was easier, and Ashki leaned against Lila May's shoulder, finally relaxing after the long day of worry. Snow continued to fall, banking against the cabin walls and muffling all sound from the outside world. But inside, wrapped in firelight and family, they were warm, safe, and together. Winter slowly released its grip on the mountain homestead. The burned remnants of the barn stood as a stark reminder of that terrible night, but hope sprouted alongside the first green shoots of spring. Word had spread through the settlement about Lila May's brave stand in town, and neighbors began appearing with lumber and willing hands. "Ain't right what they tried to do," old Jim Peterson declared, hefting a beam onto his shoulder. "Reckon we can have this raised in no time with enough folks pitching in?" The sound of hammers and saws filled the crisp morning air. Women from nearby homesteads brought bread and stew, gathering around Lila May with warm smiles and warmer welcomes. The community's embrace felt like a healing balm after years of Calvin's cruel isolation. Ashki darted between the workers, eager to help wherever he could. His quick hands passed nails and held boards steady, while his watchful eyes studied every detail of the barn's construction. When Boone felt strong enough to sit outside, wrapped in blankets, the boy would run to him for advice, then race back to share it with the builders. "You're teaching him well," Lila May said one afternoon, bringing Boone a cup of hot coffee. His cough had eased, though his face still carried the pallor of illness. "He needs both of us," Boone replied, his voice gentle but serious. He set the coffee aside and took her hand in his. "Truth is, I need you too, Lila May. Not just for Ashki's sake." His rough fingers tightened slightly around hers. "I'm asking you to stay, as my partner, my wife, if you'll have me." Lila May felt her breath catch. The old fear rose up, memories of Calvin's cruelty, of public shame, of promises broken. But as she looked at Boone's weathered face, she saw only truth there. Her gaze drifted to Ashki, laughing as he helped guide a sheep into the nearly finished barn, then back to the man before her. "I reckon I'm already home," she whispered, tears brightening her eyes. "Yes, I'll stay." Boone's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it softly, sealing their promise as the sounds of hammering and friendly voices echoed across their land. The morning dawned crystal clear, with sunlight sparkling off the last patches of snow in the shadowed hollows. Spring had crept into the valley like a gentle awakening, bringing with it the music of rushing water and the first brave shoots of green grass pushing through the earth. Lila May stepped onto the worn wooden porch, breathing in the sharp scent of pine carried on the breeze. The rebuilt barn stood proud against the mountainside, its fresh-cut timber already weathering to match the landscape. Inside, the mules announced their hunger with loud brays that echoed across the yard. Boone emerged from the cabin behind her, moving with more sureness than he had in months. Though his cough still troubled him on damp mornings, strength had returned to his broad frame. He slipped his arm around her waist, and she leaned into his solid presence. Ashki appeared moments later, his footsteps quick and light on the planks. He pressed against Lila May's side, fitting perfectly there as if he had always belonged. Together they gazed out over the valley spread before them, watching spring paint its colors across the land that was now truly theirs. Through the open cabin door, Lila May could see the framed treaty hanging on the wall, its carefully preserved pages a testament to justice won and promises kept. The sight of it still filled her heart with quiet triumph and gratitude. She closed her eyes, offering up a wordless prayer of thanksgiving. The Lord's mercy had led her here, to this place, to these people who had become her family. Second chances, she realized, came in forms you never expected. Sometimes in the shape of a gruff mountain man with a heart of gold, sometimes in the trust of a silent boy who needed nothing more than love and safety. The wind rustled through the pines, carrying the fresh scent of melting snow and new growth. In the barn, the mules called out again, reminding them that chores waited. But for this moment, they stood together, watching their valley wake to spring, their hearts full with the certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Here was hope made real, as solid as the mountains rising around them, as true as the love that had brought them together, as lasting as the land that would sustain them through all the seasons to come. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.